Malik Carter hadn't taken a real day off in 3 years, but that Saturday morning, when his 7-year-old daughter Amara looked up at him with those wide
Thank you
brown
for taking the
eyes
time to meet,
and
Miss
asked why
Harrison.
they never went
I
to the
wanted to
beach
discuss
like
the new
other
project
families,
proposal.
Of
something
course,
in him
David.
cracked.
It's a lovely
So
day
he
for
loaded
it.
her into his
What's
old
on your
Honda
mind?
Civic,
It's important we
drove
align on the
45
key
minutes to
performance
Clearwater
indicators
Beach,
before the next
and
quarter.
tried to
I
remember what
agree.
it felt like to
I've
breathe
prepared a
without
draft of the
counting the
projected
hours until
outcomes
his
for your
next
review.
shift. The sun was high and golden, the waves gentle, and for one brief moment, Malik let himself believe he deserved this. Then he glanced toward the shoreline, just a casual sweep of the horizon, and his entire world tilted. A gust of wind caught a woman's cover-up, tearing it away and exposing her bare torso before she could react. Their eyes met across the sand. Victoria Hayes, his boss, the woman who held his career in her perfectly manicured hands. Malik's stomach dropped through the earth. The first thought that crashed through his mind wasn't embarrassment. It was survival. He grabbed Amara's hand a little too tightly and steered her toward the beachside cafe, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The plastic menu trembled slightly in his grip as he pretended to study options he couldn't read, couldn't process, couldn't see past the catastrophic scenarios unfolding behind his eyes. He knew exactly how this would play out. A black man, caught looking at his white female supervisor in a state of undress. It didn't matter that he hadn't meant to look. It didn't matter that the wind was responsible. What mattered was the story that would be told. And Malik knew from bitter experience that he rarely got to be the author of his own narrative. Amara kicked her feet against the chair legs, oblivious to her father's internal collapse. She was talking about sandcastles and seashells and whether dolphins ever came close to shore. And Malik nodded at all the wrong moments, his mind trapped 3 years in the past. He remembered his first week at Hayes Design Group, how Marcus Chen from accounting had clapped him on the shoulder and said, loud enough for others to hear, that it was great the company was finally meeting its diversity quotas. He remembered the way conversations would pause when he entered the break room, resuming only after someone decided he wasn't a threat. He remembered submitting the Morrison account proposal, his best work in years, only to have it credited to his white colleague who had merely proofread the final draft. These memories lived in his body like scar tissue. Invisible, but always present. The worst part was the constant calibration required. Malik had learned to modulate his voice in meetings. Never too loud, never too assertive. He dressed more formally than his peers because anything casual might be read as unprofessional. He arrived early and left late, not because the job demanded it, but because he couldn't afford to give anyone ammunition. And still, despite all his careful navigation, he'd heard the whispers: affirmative action hire, diversity placement, the implication that his talent was secondary to his skin color, that his presence was a corporate checkbox rather than a professional achievement. Now, after one accidental glance, all that painstaking work could evaporate. Victoria Hayes didn't seem like the vindictive type, but Malik had been wrong about people before. The stakes were too high. Amara depended on him. There was no safety net, no wealthy relatives to fall back on, no second chances in an economy that had never been designed with men like him in mind. "Daddy, why does your face look like that?" Amara's question cut through his spiral. She was watching him with the uncanny perception children sometimes possess, her half-eaten grilled cheese forgotten on her plate. Malik forced his features into something resembling calm and reached across the table to wipe a spot of ketchup from her chin. He told her everything was fine, that he was just thinking about grown-up stuff, nothing she needed to worry about. But even as he said the words, he knew they were hollow. His daughter had already learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. She was 7 years old and already fluent in the language of her father's fear. The shadow fell across their table without warning. Malik looked up, and there she was. Victoria Hayes had found them. She stood in a light sundress now, her expression unreadable, and Malik felt every muscle in his body lock into defensive position. He was on his feet before he realized he'd moved, words tumbling out in a rush of preemptive apology. He swore he hadn't meant to look, that it was an accident. that he would understand completely if she wanted to report him to HR, that he respected her position and had never intended any disrespect. The sentences tangled together, desperate and clumsy. And somewhere in the middle of his frantic explanation, he became aware of the couple at the next table. They were watching him with hard eyes, the man's hand resting protectively on his wife's arm, their bodies angled as if preparing to intervene. Malik recognized that look. He'd seen it in grocery stores and parking lots and 100 other ordinary spaces where his presence was treated as a potential threat. A black man, visibly distressed, standing over a white woman. The math was already being done, conclusions already forming behind those suspicious stares. Malik. Victoria's voice cut through his panic like a blade through silk. Calm down. It was an accident. She said it simply, without drama. And then she did something that surprised him more than the encounter on the beach. She sat down, not across from him, but beside Amara, sliding into the booth with an ease that suggested she hadn't noticed the watching couple. Or perhaps had noticed and chosen not to care. She introduced herself to his daughter as Victoria, just Victoria, explaining that she worked with Amara's father but that right now she was just a lady who wanted to get out of the sun for a minute. Amara, never shy with strangers, immediately launched into a detailed explanation of why their sandcastle was going to be the best one on the entire beach. Malik sank back into his seat, his legs unsteady beneath him. The conversation flowed around him while he struggled to recalibrate. This wasn't how he'd expected the confrontation to go. Victoria was asking Amara about her favorite subjects in school, and when his daughter mentioned art class with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for ice cream, something shifted in Victoria's face, a softening, almost imperceptible, that Malik had never witnessed in 3 years of meetings and presentations and carefully professional interactions. She asked what Amara liked to draw, and his daughter's answer came without hesitation. She drew families mostly, and houses, and sometimes she drew pictures of her dad when he came home tired, because she wanted him to see how brave he looked even when he was exhausted. Victoria's eyes flickered to Malik for just a moment, and he saw something there he couldn't name. Not pity. Exactly. Something more complicated. When Amara announced that she wanted to finish her sandcastle, Victoria surprised him again by offering to help. They walked together toward the spot where his daughter had begun construction, and Malik hung back slightly, still wary, still waiting for the other shoe to drop. The beach had grown more crowded as the afternoon progressed, and Malik was acutely aware of how they must look. A black man, a white woman, a child between them. Most people didn't spare them a second glance, but some did. He caught the lingering stare of an older man in a golf shirt, the way a young mother pulled her toddler slightly closer as they passed. These micro-adjustments were so familiar they barely registered consciously anymore, just background noise in the constant symphony of being other. But then, something happened that forced him to pay attention. A middle-aged man in board shorts approached them, his posture aggressive, his jaw set. He positioned himself between Victoria and Malik, asking if everything was all right here, if this man was bothering her, if she needed any assistance. The implication was clear and ugly. Victoria rose to her feet with a grace that contained something harder underneath. Her voice was pleasant, but carried an edge that Malik recognized from boardroom negotiations. She informed the man that she was exactly where she wanted to be, with exactly the company she'd chosen, and that if he was looking for someone who needed rescuing, he should perhaps check his own assumptions. The man's face reddened. He muttered something about just making sure, and retreated without making eye contact with Malik. It was such a small thing, really. A few sentences, a moment of public clarity, but Malik felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even realized was clenched. She'd stood with him. Not in front of him, not around him, but with him. The distinction mattered more than he could articulate. They spent another hour on the beach after that. Victoria proved surprisingly adept at sandcastle architecture. employing techniques she claimed to have learned during childhood summers on Cape Cod. Amara was delighted to have such a skilled collaborator, and Malik found himself relaxing by degrees. The earlier panic slowly releasing its grip on his nervous system. He learned things about Victoria Hayes that 3 years of professional proximity had never revealed. She was the middle child of 3 sisters, raised by a single father after their mother left when Victoria was 9. She had wanted to be a marine biologist before business school redirected her ambitions. She kept a small succulent on her office windowsill named Gerald, after a grandfather she'd never met. These details painted a picture of a person rather than a position, and Malik wasn't sure what to do with this new information. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Victoria mentioned that she needed to head out. But before she left, she said something that caught Malik off guard. She told him the Henderson presentation had been rescheduled to Wednesday, so he shouldn't worry about rushing to prepare anything over the weekend. Malik's mind raced, recalculating deadlines he'd already memorized. The original timeline had been brutal, requiring him to sacrifice what little remained of his weekend. This change meant nothing to Victoria. Probably just a minor calendar adjustment in her world of constant scheduling. But to Malik, it meant 2 days of breathing room. 2 days when he could be a father instead of an employee. He thanked her, probably too formally given the afternoon they'd shared, and she waved it off as though it were nothing. Then Amara did something that would stay with Malik for years. She ran over to the small pile of shells she'd been collecting and selected one with careful deliberation. It was a scallop shell, pale pink with delicate ridges, and she pressed it into Victoria's palm with the solemnity of a sacred offering. She told Victoria it was a lucky shell, that she was supposed to keep it forever, that it would make good things happen. Victoria looked at the shell for a long moment, and Malik watched something move behind her eyes. She crouched down to Amara's level and thanked her with a sincerity that seemed to cost her something, as though accepting gifts was not something she did easily or often. When she stood again and met Malik's gaze, there was an openness in her expression that hadn't been there before. He felt a pull toward her that had nothing to do with workplace hierarchy, and he immediately shut it down. She was his boss. Whatever warmth had passed between them today was an anomaly, a brief intersection of their separate lives that would correct itself come Monday morning. He couldn't afford to misread kindness for something more. The drive home was quiet. Amara fell asleep in her car seat before they reached the highway, her face peaceful, her small hands still dusted with sand. Malik replayed the afternoon in fragments, trying to make sense of it. Victoria Hayes had seen him at his most vulnerable, and instead of wielding that power, she had dismantled it. He didn't know what to do with a world that contained that possibility. Monday arrived with its usual weight. Malik moved through the morning routine on autopilot, packing Amara's lunch, braiding her hair, dropping her at school with a kiss on the forehead and a promise to pick her up on time. But underneath the familiar motions, anxiety hummed like a low current. The beach existed outside of time, outside of context. The office was different. The office had rules, written and unwritten, and Malik had spent years learning to navigate them. He didn't know if Saturday's encounter had changed those rules or merely exposed how fragile they'd always been. The elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, and he felt it immediately. Something was different. Conversations paused half a beat too long as he passed. Eyes tracked his movement with a curiosity that felt more pointed than usual. By the time he reached his desk, the source of the attention became clear. Someone had seen them. Someone from the company had been at Clearwater Beach, had witnessed Victoria Hayes sitting with Malik Carter and his daughter, and had decided that information was worth sharing. The specifics of what had been reported remained unclear, but the fact of it hung in the air like smoke. Malik's stomach churned as he settled into his chair and powered on his computer. He was scrolling through emails when he noticed it. Sitting in the center of his desk, positioned with obvious intention, was a small glass sculpture. It was a sandcastle, delicate and intricate, catching the fluorescent light in ways that made it seem almost alive. Beside it lay a card, the handwriting elegant and feminine. "Some structures are worth rebuilding," it read, and the signature was a single letter, V. Malik stared at the object for a long moment, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Around him, coworkers pretended not to watch, but he could feel their attention like heat on his skin. He looked up and found Victoria standing in the doorway of her corner office, one hand resting against the frame. She met his eyes across the open floor plan, and in that brief exchange, something was communicated that words would have complicated. She gave him a small nod, almost imperceptible, and then returned to whatever meeting or call or decision awaited her inside. It was an acknowledgement and a reassurance, all contained in a gesture that lasted less than 2 seconds. The beach hadn't been a fluke. The connection they'd stumbled into wasn't going to be erased by fluorescent lights and corporate protocols. Malik didn't know what that meant for his future at Hayes Design Group, but for the first time in 3 years, the uncertainty didn't feel entirely like a threat. The week progressed, and Malik began to notice things he'd missed before. Small things, mostly, but they accumulated into a pattern he couldn't ignore. Victoria's door remained open more often than it used to. She solicited his opinion in meetings where he would typically have been overlooked. She remembered details he'd mentioned in passing, the name of Amara's school, the neighborhood where they lived, the fact that he'd once dreamed of starting his own design firm. Each acknowledgement felt like a stitch in some larger fabric he couldn't yet see the shape of. But alongside these moments of connection, something darker was also taking form. Marcus Chen, the colleague who'd made the diversity quota comment years ago, had apparently decided that Malik's changing status required intervention. It started subtly, a project assignment that landed on Malik's desk with unreasonable deadlines, a casual comment in the break room about certain people getting special treatment from leadership. But during Thursday's team meeting, Marcus dispensed with subtlety entirely. He suggested that Malik's workload should be increased since he'd proven himself capable of handling less technical responsibilities. The implication clear. When Malik began to respond, his tone careful and measured despite the anger burning in his chest, Victoria's voice cut through the room. She stated that Malik's designs were better than half the department and suggested Marcus fix his tone. The silence that followed was total. Later that afternoon, Malik's phone buzzed with a video call notification. Amara's face filled the screen, her eyes glassy, her voice thick with congestion. The school nurse explained she'd developed a fever and needed to be picked up immediately. Malik's mind raced through his schedule. The Henderson presentation prep, the client call at 3. The mountain of revisions still waiting on his desk. He began to explain that he could be there in an hour, maybe 90 minutes if he worked through lunch, but Victoria appeared beside him before he finished the sentence. She'd been passing by and caught enough of the conversation to understand. She told him to go. That family came first. That they could discuss a more flexible arrangement when he returned. Malik searched her face for signs of professional obligation, the kind of accommodation that came with strings attached. He found none. That evening, while Amara dozed on the couch with a cool cloth on her forehead, Malik's phone rang. Victoria's name on the screen made his heart stutter. She was calling to check on Amara, she said, and to talk through some ideas for the Henderson pitch. But the conversation drifted into different territory. She told him about her own father, how he'd raised 3 daughters alone after their mother walked out. How she'd learned to associate love with showing up rather than saying pretty words. She mentioned that she'd kept Amara's shell on her dresser, that she looked at it every morning while getting ready for work. Malik found himself sharing things he hadn't planned to share. The exhaustion of single parenting, the guilt of never feeling like enough, the way Amara sometimes called out for a mother in her sleep. They talked for over an hour, and when they finally hung up, Malik sat in the quiet of his living room and wondered what was happening to his carefully constructed boundaries. The Harrison Industries meeting was the biggest presentation of the quarter, and Malik had poured everything into it. He'd worked late nights and early mornings, refining concepts and rehearsing pitches until the material lived in his bones. But when he walked into the conference room and saw Nathaniel Harrison sitting at the head of the table, something cold settled in his stomach. Harrison was old money, old school, old everything. His eyes passed over Malik with a dismissiveness that felt almost physical, settling on the white junior designer standing nervously behind him. Harrison asked the junior designer a question about the campaign's core concept, and Malik realized with a sickening clarity that he hadn't been seen at all. He'd been categorized, labeled, and filed away before he'd even opened his mouth. Before Malik could respond, Victoria was on her feet. Her voice was pleasant, but carried an authority that silenced the room. She clarified that Malik led this campaign, that all questions and feedback should be addressed to him. The senior designer beside him was there to observe and learn. Harrison's expression flickered, a mix of surprise and something uglier quickly suppressed. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had shifted. Malik delivered his pitch with a confidence that surprised even him, and by the end of the hour, Harrison was shaking his hand and complimenting his vision. The victory should have felt sweet. Instead, Malik felt a complicated tangle of gratitude and shame. Victoria had stood up for him, had used her position and privilege to force respect from a man who would never have offered it freely. He was grateful beyond measure, but he also knew that she would never need someone to do the same for her, and that inequality sat heavy in his chest as they filed out of the conference room. He found her in her office that evening, long after most of the staff had gone home. The city lights glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Victoria sat silhouetted against them. Her shoes kicked off under her desk, her usual composure softened by exhaustion. Malik knocked on the open door, and she looked up with a smile that did something complicated to his pulse. He thanked her for what she'd done in the Harrison meeting, and she dismissed it with a wave of her hand, said it was nothing, that she was just correcting an obvious error in perception. But Malik pressed forward. He told her she didn't understand what it meant, what it cost him to need that kind of intervention, what it cost her to provide it. He explained that he'd spent his entire career trying to be so good that his race wouldn't matter, and every time someone had to fight for his basic respect, it felt like proof that he'd failed. Victoria was quiet for a long moment after he finished. When she spoke, her voice was different, stripped of its professional polish. She admitted she'd never thought about it that way, that she'd seen him as competent and talented and deserving, without considering the weight he carried just to be seen. She apologized, not for helping, but for not understanding sooner. The conversation turned, as their conversations had begun to do, toward something more personal. She asked about Amara, about his late wife, about the life he'd built from the wreckage of loss. He found himself telling her about Maya, how they'd met at a coffee shop in college, how she'd died in a car accident when Amara was 2, how he still sometimes reached for her in his sleep. Victoria listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she shared her own story. A broken engagement 3 years ago, a man who'd wanted her success but not her ambition, who'd asked her to choose between her career and his comfort. She'd chosen herself, and she'd been alone ever since. The office felt smaller somehow, the space between them charged with a new kind of awareness. Victoria mentioned the company picnic that weekend, said she hoped he and Amara would come, said it would mean a lot to her if they did. Her voice dropped on the last few words, carrying a weight that exceeded professional courtesy. Malik heard what she wasn't saying. The invitation beneath the invitation. He said they'd be there. The drive home felt different, the city lights brighter, the radio music sweeter. He didn't know where this was heading, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The company picnic sprawled across a private section of Vinoy Park, catered tables and lawn games and clusters of employees, enjoying the rare chance to see each other outside of fluorescent lighting. Malik arrived with Amara's hand in his, her sundress bright yellow against the green grass, her excitement barely contained. He'd been to company events before, had learned to navigate them with careful neutrality, present but not too present, friendly but never familiar. But today felt different. Today, Victoria was watching for him. She found them within minutes of their arrival. Drifting away from a conversation with the CFO to crouch down and greet Amara like an old friend. Amara showed her the bracelet she'd made that morning. A friendship bracelet that she'd brought specifically for Victoria. And something passed across Victoria's face that looked almost like wonder. They walked together through the crowd, and Malik felt the attention of his colleagues like spotlights. He saw the raised eyebrows, the whispered comments, the rapid reassessment happening behind polite smiles. Victoria Hayes. Spending the entire afternoon with a junior designer and his daughter, the implications were being catalogued and analyzed, and by Monday, the office would be humming with speculation. Amara asked if she could draw Victoria, and Victoria said yes without hesitation. They found a quiet spot beneath an oak tree, and Malik watched his daughter work with the fierce concentration she brought to all her art. The finished picture showed Victoria smiling, really smiling, her hair loose and her eyes bright. Amara had added something that made Malik's breath catch. She'd drawn herself between them, holding both their hands, 3 figures united under a yellow sun. Victoria stared at the picture for a long moment, and when she looked up, her eyes were wet. She thanked Amara in a voice that wasn't entirely steady, and Malik understood that something had shifted. Some wall had come down, some door had opened that couldn't be closed again. The afternoon wound down, and families began drifting toward the parking lot. Malik gathered their things while Amara said extended goodbyes to the other children she'd befriended. Victoria walked with them to the edge of the park, her pace slow, her reluctance obvious. She mentioned that she'd had a wonderful time, that Amara was remarkable, that she was glad they came, but underneath the pleasant words, Malik heard something else. A question, maybe. An opening. He told her he was glad too. The silence between them stretched, full of things unsaid. That night, after Amara was asleep, Malik sat on his back porch and watched the stars emerge one by one. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria, just a few words. "Thank you for today. That picture is already framed." He typed a response, deleted it, typed another. What finally sent was simple and honest. "She's lucky to have you in her life." The reply came almost immediately. "So am I." Malik stared at the screen for a long time, his heart doing something it hadn't done in years. The first Saturday of November brought them back to Clearwater Beach, but this time, everything was different. 6 months had passed since the accident that brought them together, and the landscape of Malik's life had transformed in ways he couldn't have predicted. Victoria had been promoted to Chief Creative Officer, but had insisted on keeping her involvement with Malik's team. The whispers at the office had evolved from speculation to acceptance, the scandal they'd expected never quite materializing. Amara had started asking when Victoria would come to dinner, treating her presence in their lives as an established fact rather than a question. The beach was quieter in November, the summer crowds replaced by joggers and retirees and the occasional family seeking solitude. Malik spread their blanket in the same spot where he'd accidentally seen Victoria that first day, and the symmetry wasn't lost on either of them. Amara ran immediately toward the water, her laughter carrying on the salt breeze. Victoria settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long moment, neither spoke. The waves provided rhythm to their silence, and the sun painted everything in shades of gold. Then Victoria's hand found his on the blanket between them, her fingers intertwining with his like they'd done it 1,000 times before. Malik didn't pull away. He'd spent 6 months fighting this, reminding himself of the complications and the power dynamics and the 1,000 ways it could go wrong. But sitting here now, with the woman who'd seen him at his lowest and chosen to stand beside him anyway, the arguments felt hollow. He told her he was grateful for that wind, back in May. The words came out rougher than he intended, thick with everything he hadn't said during the months of careful professional distance. Victoria turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the ocean's shifting light. She said that sometimes life forces us to see what we were too busy to notice. Her thumb traced circles on the back of his hand, and Malik felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut since Maya died. Amara's voice cut through the moment, demanding their immediate assistance with a sandcastle of unprecedented ambition. They rose together, their hands separating naturally, and walked toward the water's edge where his daughter waited with imperious expectation. The three of them built together, Victoria offering architectural advice, Amara directing operations with the authority of a tiny general, Malik watching the two of them and wondering how he'd gotten here. The castle grew impressive, turrets and walls and a moat that kept filling with seawater. When it was finished, Amara declared it the best one ever made in the history of the entire world. And Victoria agreed with appropriate solemnity. The sun began its descent, and they packed up their things slowly, none of them eager to end the day. Victoria carried Amara on her hip toward the car, his daughter's arms wrapped around her neck with easy trust. Malik followed behind, carrying the cooler and the beach bags, watching the two of them together. Victoria was saying something that made Amara giggle. Her face lit up in a way he'd never seen in any boardroom or client meeting. This was who she was underneath the title and the corner office and the carefully maintained composure. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with. At the car, Amara demanded that Victoria sit with her in the back, and Victoria complied without protest. Malik adjusted his rearview mirror as he pulled out of the parking lot, catching glimpses of them in the back seat. Victoria was helping Amara organize her shell collection, their heads bent together in consultation. He thought about Maya, wondered if she would approve of this turn his life had taken. He liked to think she would. She'd always wanted him to be happy, had made him promise in those final terrible hours that he would keep living, keep loving, keep building something beautiful from the rubble. He'd kept the first two promises as best he could. Maybe now he could finally keep the third. The drive home took them through neighborhoods Malik knew by heart, past the grocery store where he bought Amara's favorite cereal, the school where she was learning to read, the small house they'd made into a home. Victoria had been here before, for dinners and movie nights and lazy Sunday afternoons, but this felt different. This felt like a rival. When they pulled into the driveway, Amara had fallen asleep against Victoria's shoulder, her face peaceful, her small hand clutching a pink shell. Victoria looked at him over his daughter's sleeping head, and in that look was everything they hadn't yet said aloud. The complications hadn't disappeared. There would be HR conversations and adjusted reporting structures and colleagues who wouldn't understand. But as Malik sat in the fading light with his daughter asleep and the woman he loved watching him with eyes full of possibility, he realized that some structures were worth rebuilding. Some risks were worth taking. Some moments that shouldn't have happened turned out to be exactly what was meant to be.